Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for the nice introduction. And in fact, believe me, indeed, every time I get this opportunity, I always feel there's an opportunity to learn more because for speaking of it, you have to study more. And I have actually benefited whenever you call me for the sessions. So today's session, what we're going to do is that we have about an hour or so to discuss the tax issues for NBFCs. So the way I have divided my presentation, is I guess broadly in two parts. One is, we have to, and what I understand that since morning, all the regulatory sections have happened. So the focus, since morning was probably on regulations. So we may just want to, touch upon the relevant provisions, which are there, or which are most significant for NBFCs, and then we can go into specific issues. We have identified about 8 to 10 issues which are very specific to the NBFCs, and we can session. So, NBFC means they have a lot of interest income. Certainly they have advisory income as well. But often, we forget what does interest mean. And we have a specific definition of interest in section 228A. And before we can characterize something as an interest, okay, it's essential that you fulfill the requirement of the definition. The definition requires a relationship of borrower and lender, okay, and certainly it's a little enlarged definition. But unless and until you satisfy the definition, there is always a question mark whether you can call a particular item of income as an interest, and whether a tax treatment given to interest in the Act should be followed. And when we look at a couple of issues, we'll have this question mark whether the income should be characterized as interest in this case or not. Then we have the issue of deduction for NPAs and the provisioning requirements. We have a specific provision, which deals with bad debts and which clarifies that a provision created is not to be treated as a bad debts and deduction should not be allowed. We have a certain specific provision which permits deduction for NPA interest on doubtful debts, okay, but it is available only to banks and not to NBFCs. The core provision, which is relevant for all the tax issues for NBFCs, is section 145. You're supposed to offer your income to tax as per the method of accounting followed by you regularly. And as we proceed in the course of discussion, we'll say what is the implication of this. Next couple of sections 61, 161. These are specific sections related to taxation of trust. Okay, and these provisions are becoming relevant because when we look at the structures which are created, and I would say last few years, around securitization, around ARCs and all, these structures are around creation of a trust and then investors participating in a particular activity through this trust, and that's why it also becomes relevant to study these provisions, and we'll go into the relevant sections at the relevant point of time. And then we have two specific provisions which are relevant for securitization and trust. As we look into this structure, we look at those provisions. Now, let's start with a very basic understanding, which a lot of us would have, is that taxability of interest, is it to be offered to tax on a due basis or income to? And especially this is the question is relevant for a situation wherein as on 31st of March, you are holding an instrument of which the interest is to be paid in June. So the question is whether for 3 months, Jan to March, whether you offer the interest to tax or not, because you are going to realize that cash only in the month of June. As on 31st of March, you don't have right to ask for that money. So that's a core question, and for whatever reason, the understanding which is prevalent, amongst a lot of our professionals, and even I used to carry this risk for a very long period of time. Until about a few months back when I said that it's possible to look at it in a different manner. The understanding is that this interest is to be offered to tax only when I realize this money from the borrower or from the company which has issued the instrument, and not as on 31st of March. And that has been a result of major debate. These are the judicial precedents which are typically relied upon to claim that this interest is not to be taxed as on 31st of March and is to be offered to tax only on the due payment basis. If you see the first judgment which is relied upon is as old as 1954. Okay, then you have a subsequent Vijay Bank judgment which is 1991, and then you have the recent judgments 2012, 13, 14, who all kind of following the old cases. So now let's look at what could be the correct position, and let's look at the judgment of E.D. Sassoon, okay, which is typically relied upon to say that unless and until a party has a right to receive the income, there is no tax liability. So you will find this paragraph which is produced here, getting reproduced in a lot of the case laws, and this is something which even the recent judgments are relying upon. And the crux of the understanding is that income accrues when the assessee acquires a right to receive the income. Okay, and the assessee must have created a debt in his favor. Unless and until someone is obliged to make a payment to him, the income doesn't become taxable. So there's a broader understanding which gets created from this judgment, and I believe it will be worthwhile to spend some time understanding the facts of the judgment. And before that, we may also want to spend some time on the CBDT circular which was issued in 2002 on deep discount bond. Deep discount bonds essentially are instruments which are issued at a discount, and the entire face value is paid on the date of maturity. So let's say instrument may have been issued at a price of 85 rupees or 90 rupees, and a couple of years or maybe 4 or 5 years down the line, what will be depending on the rate of interest. When the maturity happens, the holder of the instrument is going to get full 100 rupee as a redemption proceeds. And there's a guidance given by CBDT as to how the income arising from this instrument is to be offered to tax. So CBDT presumes that either the holder of the instrument could be holding it as a capital asset, or so is an investor, or is in the business of, or the instrument is held by him as part of his business. So he is supposed to offer interest to income to tax on a yearly basis. He is supposed to do a mark to market, and he offered the income to tax either as an interest income or as a business profit as a part of valuation, year on year basis. And this is on the basis that the value of the instrument is increasing as the time passes. And then there is also guidance given as to how the income is to be offered to tax on the date of maturity, and what happens if the instrument is sold before the date of maturity, or it is purchased before the date of maturity from someone else. Again, there are doubts raised by people as to whether this judgment or whether this circular is laying down the correct position in law, and that's the doubts are there because of the earlier judicial precedents. So with that, let's look at some of the provisions which were relevant when this judgment came. So as we all remember, if you all may remember that earlier we should have a sixth head of income, which was interest on securities, which was section 18 to section 21, and the entire chapter got deleted in 1989. Now, as per this chapter, as per this head of income, the scheme of this taxation was that the income was to be offered to tax, interest income was to be offered to tax when the amount was due and not on a accrual basis. So this was a basic provision which prevailed at that point of time, and I'm sure Similar provision was there probably in 1922 Act as well, because we are doing some of the judgment which was said way back in 1956. And then what happened? In 89, section 18 got deleted, and the same provision, with little different language, got introduced as a provision to section 145, and which continued in the Act till 1995. So even from 89 to 1995, the law prevailed that the interest income is to be offered to tax on due basis, and so you offer your tax only when you have a right to receive that income. Now, when you look at the current provision, these provisions are no more exist. They are not there in the law now. We have section 145 which says that you have to offer your income to tax as per the method of accounting followed by you. And my belief is that in most of the cases, your method of accounting will compel you, that the Makkad method of accounting which is generally followed will compel the person to accrue the entire interest for 3 months in the balance sheet as on 31st of March. So you accrue the income in your books of accounts, and hence you have to offer it to tax, because that's the method of accounting which you are following. So the very basis on which the judgments which were given in the past has changed. The provisions are different now, and then probably it's not correct to keep on relying on an old judgment. As I said that even now, if you look at the judgment which are passed as near as 2014, okay, they are still relying on the old principles, the old judgments. But probably it's out of ignorance of everyone, I would want to say. So to amend the correct position as regards the taxation of interest on this kind of securities is that on 31st of March the income does accrue to you and you have to offer it to tax. And if you look at from that perspective, there is probably nothing wrong in CBD circular number 2 of 2002, because the income does accrue to you and that is to be offered to tax as per the method of accounting followed by the company. Now, what was E.D. Sassoon's case? Let's spend some time on E.D. Sassoon. This was the case, in the olden days. There was a different business which prevailed of managing companies, it's called managing agencies. So E.D. Sassoon probably was an individual or a partnership firm, which was in the business of this kind of managing. And as per the terms of the contract, the compensation for managing agencies was payable at the end of the year. So you work for the entire year and you will be paid only after the year is over. And there were structures wherein your compensation was getting decided on the basis of the performance of the company, which again will be linked to the performance of the managing agent. Now, in this case, E.D. Sassoon, they did not continue work for the entire year, and before completion of the year, they sold the agency to a third party, let's say X. And E.D. Sassoon did get a compensation or a consideration for transferring these managing agencies from X. And obviously the taxation of that compensation or consideration would be separate, which was never a matter of dispute in this case. Now what happened, when the assessment of X was happening, X got the entire consideration for the entire year, and the issue which arose based on the argument which X would have taken, that whether a part of the compensation received by X from the company managed, whether that part should be subject to tax in the hands of E.D. Sassoon. So the new manager X got a commission for the entire year, and the issue before the board was whether a part of that commission should be subjected to tax in the hands of E.D. Sassoon, who essentially transferred the agency. Obviously, and when you look at the observations of the court, they are to be seen in that context. Okay, E.D. Sassoon did not get a right to receive any income as far as the companies are concerned, and these observations are certainly correct as far as the context are concerned. That context is there. But if you look at on the overall basis, if we continue applying ED suspension in various cases, the principle of accrual, could certainly have a challenge, because in our day-to-day business, day-to-day activities, as on 31st of March, there would be several instances wherein the amount is not receivable, but your right is accruing with the passage of time. So that was the first issue, which I thought was, there was a lot of perception about this, and I thought it would be relevant to discuss this issue. The next issue, probably a far more simpler one, and that's on the TDS on these instruments. And the question before the Mumbai Tribunal in this case was that whether the company is required to deduct tax on the interest which it accrues in the books of accounts as on 31st of March. And the reason for this question was because the company would say that these are transferable instruments and it does not necessarily know that finally who will be entitled to receive the interest income. And then the tribunal said that the company did not deduct tax because there's uncertainty as to who's going to ultimately get the income. And for that reason, the issuer decided in their favor. There's also a reference to a letter issued by CBDT to DISCO in the judgment, and which was on a similar basis. Now, coming to NBFCs, and I'm sure a lot of the industry players would want to believe, and rightly so, that as far as tax is concerned, we are kind of discriminated, because the business is broadly comparable to that of a banking entity. But when it comes to tax treatment, a logical tax treatment which is offered, a logical tax regime which is offered to banks, is not something which is getting offered to NBFCs. And I have listed 3 to 4 major items. So the first major item is interest in NPAs. As per the regulations, the banks and NBFCs are not supposed to accrue interest on NPAs in the books of accounts. And the banks are, while the banks are given concession, Section 43 provides that the bank needs to offer their income to tax only when it receives the income or the income is accrued as per the method of accounting. So bank will not be in a situation where it has to offer something to tax which there's a doubt on the receipt of that income. Similarly, provision for balance doubtful debts. There is a specific provision for banks and certain other financial institutions which says that they are allowed certain percentage of as a deduction for the provisions which are created for the doubtful debts, which is not there for NBFCs. TDS on interest, the banks are exempted from interest, whereas NBFCs are not. Especially the NBFCs receiving this income are subjected to TDS, and that's a kind of liquidity issue for the NBFCs. And again, when it comes to treatment of amalgamation, benefit of carry forward is not available to the NBFCs because they are not qualifying as an industrial undertaking. Now let's look at some of the issues in a little more greater detail. As I said, the regulations do not permit the NBFCs to recognize interest on NPAs as income in the books of accounts. And the logic is obvious. If there's a doubt on the ability of the payer to repay the principal itself, then there's a question of we recognizing any interest income the principal. Now, what is the industry practice on this? The industry practice is not to offer this interest to tax. Certainly, this interest is not recognized as income in your books of accounts. So when you start a computation of income as per your profit, as per your opinion accounts, you're not going to offer the income to tax. And even after knowing that this is a debatable issue, probably largely the industry has preferred to abstain from offering this income to tax. And this has been a major issue of litigation. A related issue which comes up is that from the payer side, the payer may credit the interest to the credit of NBFC, and the payer has an obligation to deduct tax. So the payer will deduct tax, and that will go in the system. And when the officer does the assessment, officer would want to tax the income in the hands of the NBFC based on the TDS documents. Whereas NBFC has never received the principal amount. So this becomes this issue comes into picture from that perspective also. So let's look at where are we on the litigation on this issue. We have fair bit of judgments which are now coming in favor of NBFCs on these issues, and the high courts, especially Delhi and a recent unreported judgment of Mumbai High Court, they have decided the issue in favor of NBFCs, and when you look at this, a lot of principles get tested, and one of the arguments which is often made by the NBFCs is that there is no real income. The method of accounting they are following is mercantile, but as per the method of accounting, they are not offering to tax, and they are compliant with 145. Whereas the department says that as per the method of accounting, you are supposed to offer it to tax. So you are supposed to recognize this income. So the department is bound to challenge the method of accounting itself. And the SSC would also want to rely on the real income. That when there is a question mark on the ability of the borrower to repay the principal itself. Okay, there's no case for recognizing any income on interest side of it, and even if that's done, that would only be an accounting treatment. There's no scope for receiving such income, and that's why the income is not subject to tax. So the controversy is getting in favor of the NBFCs, especially with this 2 High Court judgments. The department relies on certain cases which are getting kind of overruled or which are getting distinguished by the courts on various counts. The next issue is provision for bad and doubtful debts. Again, as per the regulatory requirements, the banks are required to create a provision for the doubtful debts. So they have to debit a P&L account with this provision. And then the question comes up whether this provision is an allowable expenditure. We have explanation 1 to section 36(1)(7). 36(1)(7) essentially deals with deduction for bad debts. And the provision says, the explanation provides that a provision created for doubtful debt is not to be treated as bad debts. So NBFC is kind of denied deduction for this provision under section 36(1)(7). Section 36(1)(7)(a), which specifically deals with provision for bad debts, is not available to NBFCs. It's available only to banks and certain other financial institutions. Again, the SSCs, the NBFCs would have tried to claim deduction under section 37, saying that okay, fine, allow me as a normal business expenditure. And then again, the language of section 37 comes in the way. The courts have said that, well, if the deduction of the expenses is of the nature which is covered by section 30 to 36, then you don't get a deduction under section 37(1). So this has become an issue, and typically the issue is is going against the NBFCs. And I'll deal with the relevant case law on that. The issue which comes up is that when an NBFC has to offer this income to tax, in a subsequent year there will also be a MAT implications, assuming that NBFC has to offer income to tax on a MAT basis in the subsequent year, and that's why so there could be a kind of a double adverse implications for the NBFC. So the issue of deduction for provisioning is for the moment decided against the NBFCs by the Supreme Court judgment in the case of Southern Technologies. And again, the SSC has taken all the arguments and which are kind of rejected by the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says that the provision of NPA as per RBI directions is is not an expenditure for the NBFCs. And the main reason for this, is also the specific denial in section 3617. So if you look at the earlier issue, probably it was possible for NBFCs to come out of it on the basis of real income theory, or saying that there's nothing income is being approved. But then there was no specific section in the Act which was going against them. Whereas here, you have a provision in the Act which is provision to section 3617, which specifically denies, deduction for certain types of expenses which could be qualifying as a provision. And that's why it's going against the NBFCs. The issue was also challenged, the validity of the provision was challenged, saying that there's a discrimination happening against the NBFCs vis-a-vis bank. So the constitutional validity was challenged before the Supreme Court, and that issue also got decided against the NBFCs, for the reason that the manner in which the banks operate, is different than the manner in which the NBFCs have to operate. And especially the banks have this challenge of liquidity crunch, because the depositors would come and take out money at any point of time, which probably is not the case with NBFCs. So this issue of provision for patent doubtful debts is settled against the NBFCs. Well, let's come to the requirement of section 194A, which is TDS and interest. So NBFCs have to face a TDS of 10% on their interest income, and obviously in some cases the NBFCs clear with thin margin. The spread between the rate of interest they can earn and the rate of interest which they have to pay is very less, and the margin will not be as high as 10%. So that's where they have a a challenge, and this TDS could become a question of survival, or in some cases. And then the option which probably they have is to optional certificate under section 187 from the department, and there are practical challenges because the certificate officer may require names of the recipient, or the payer. The specific party names would be required, and which could be hurdle at some point of time. There would also be a difficulty in reconciliation of TDS and income, because the payer may be following a different cycle, different system, and that's where again the NBFCs could have challenges in claiming the TDS. Okay, now let's look at a couple of other cases or issues which are typically faced by the NBFCs. One is processing fee. The NBFCs would typically charge a certain percentage as a processing fee on the loans granted, and these are charged upfront. And as per the accounting system followed by the NBFCs, these processing fees are required to be amortized over a period of time in the books of accounts. So the question which comes up is that when does the income become chargeable to tax? If you follow 145 as per the method of accounting, you need not offer the entire income to tax in the first year itself. Whereas the stand which the tax authorities would take is that the amount which you have received is not likely to go back. You have full control over the money, it becomes your money, and that's why you should pay it, offer it to tax in the first year itself when you receive that processing fee. Again, if you offer the entire income to tax in the year of receipt, you're going to have a MAT implication in the subsequent years, because the credit for the income will come to your P&L over a period of time, and if you happen to be in a MAT for those years, you'll have kind of a double taxation. In certain transactions, what NBFCs do is that they collect cash deposits upfront. So let's say a loan amount loan given is of rupees, say 1 crore, and out of that 1 crore, let's say rupees 5 lakh is retained upfront as a non-refundable qualified deposit. So the cash flow is, the NBFC would give only 95 lakh rupees to the borrower. 5 lakhs is retained by it, as a non-refundable deposit, and this amount appears as an asset in the books of account. It's not it's not taken as an income in the books of account by the NBFC. And again, the question is, at what point of time this amount becomes taxable? In the last installment, when the loan is to be completely settled, this amount gets adjusted against the amount paid by the borrower, because that much he did not receive upfront. And again, the question is, how do you deal with this cash deposit which is collected upfront? If you look at the method of accounting which is followed, as per the method of accounting, this is not your income in the year of receipt of this income, and you can always say that this is not my income. But the counter argument from the tax authorities is going to be is that the amount is completely under your control, and you're not obligated to repay this amount, so you should be offering this income tax. On the similar issue, there are disputes for the banks on the guarantee commission, and the guarantee commission, the way it works is in a similar manner. The entire commission is typically paid by the person taking guarantee to the bank in the first year itself, and the tenure of the guarantee could be more than 1 year, could be 2 years, 3 years, and as per the method of accounting, the banks would offer this guarantee to tax in a staggered manner, depending on the duration. And the banks would, the department would say that nobody has received the entire income, and you should offer it to tax. And there are a couple of, I think, tribunal rulings on this issue, wherein the tribunal has really gone into the depth of the issue. They have seen the agreement, they have seen the rights and obligations of the parties, and what they have held is that wherever there is a possibility that for some reason the bank may have to give that amount back to the person of taking guarantee, the bank did not offer that entire tax in the first year itself. Again, a very interesting issue comes up, which is of subvention payment. So the way this entire thing works is that typically when we buy a car from a dealer on a finance basis, we take a loan for that. There are captive NBFCs, which are kind of a part of the same group which manufactures the car. So you may have a captive NBFC for say Ford or Maruti or Hyundai or some other Volkswagen or other car manufacturers. And to increase the sales, what they do is that they offer the loan at a concessional price to the car purchaser. So let's presume that the market rate of interest should be 18%. So the dealer will sell the car, and the financer would give the loan, let's say, at a rate of 12%. And then the loss of 6%, which is made by the financer, is made good by the parent, which is a car manufacturer, as a subvention payment. So it's like a subsidy given to the financing company. The entire objective is to increase the sales of cars, because if you offer a discount on interest rate, obviously the chances of you selling your cars, number of more cars, is higher. And the question which comes up is that what is the tax treatment of this subvention payment? Is it taxable in the hands of the recipient, or it is a capital receipt? Is it in the nature of interest, because it's essentially it represents the difference between the rate of interest, and it is subject to withholding tax. Now, obviously, these issues are yet to be adjudicated by the courts in the context of NBFCs. But then we have certain principles which are emerging from the old cases, which should be relevant. So we have a Supreme Court judgment in the case of Sahani Steel, okay, which says that a subsidy given to assist the assessed to carry on his state of business is a trading receipt and is not a capital receipt. So while the financing entity may be interested in claiming that the subsidy which is receiving is in the nature of capital receipt, because it's not income, it's just money received from the parent and should not be accrued tax. Whereas the Supreme Court has held that if the subsidy happens for assisting the entity to carrying out the state of business, then that should be treated as a trading receipt. Now, if you look at on a totality basis, what's happening is that the financing entity is not earning any profit. It's just getting something as a gift or a donation from the parent company, and on the top of it, there will be tax levied on that income. So from a commercial perspective, it may not be making a lot of sense, because ultimately you have no income, but you're supposed to offer tax on something.
Parent claim that payment as expense.
Parent, again, it would be an issue in the hands of the parent as well. Okay, but parent should be in a position to claim it as an expense.
Then it defeats the purpose, right? If someone claims it as expense.
Yes. So from that parity or a matching principle, if the parent is in a position to get it as an expense, the subsidy should be offering it to tax.
How will you time it? Typically, if the loan is for 5 years,
yes.
So pension would get it for upfront to get it to 6% which you mentioned in your case?
Well, in practice, it would differ from company to company. So, there could be cases wherein the parent may want to make a kind of a one-time settlement at the end of the year.
Present value of all future.
So, it could be happening on a year-on-year basis, or a lump sum payment in the first year itself. And if it happens to be lump sum payment, then obviously there's a bigger question mark, because that's pertaining to the entire tenure of the loan. So certainly, I mean, these issues are yet to be litigated, because these are some of the new issues, which we come to know, which are there in the market. But it's yet to be litigated, in that sense, and that's why some of those principles are going to be useful. Well, again, there's a question of characterization of income on the sale of securities. NBFCs, do indulge in purchase and sale of financial securities. And the question which often comes up is that, what is the character of the income which is generated by the sale of the securities? Is it in the nature of business income, or is it capital receipt? And the principle which is emerging is that it will always depend on the facts and circumstances of each case. CBDT has probably made 2 attempts to clarify the issue. One in 1989, there was a CBDT instruction, which summarized the principles based on which one is supposed to decide whether the asset is held on a capital account or it's a stock in trade. And again in 2007, when this issue became more relevant for FIIs, again they came out with another circular which reiterated some of the earlier points they were listed and some of the new points. So broadly the principle which emerges is probably there is no a single principle based on which the issue can be decided. One is to look at the facts and circumstances of the entire the business carried on by the NBFC. NBFCs would classify certain things as a long-term asset in the books of accounts, and some of them may be appearing as a stock in trade. So these factors would help in come to a conclusion. The factors such as frequency of trade, what the objective when the asset was first purchased, how long the asset was kept held by the SSE, all this would go on to decide. But again, uncertainty as regards this issue is going to prevail. Again, a specific feature of NBFC's business is that at times the the loans and portfolios of debt are getting sold from one party to another party. So an NBFC may have given loan, to 5 parties or 10 parties, and then the entire debt is transferred from that NBFC that's originated in NBFC to some other NBFC or a bank. And then the question which comes up is that what is the character of the income which is generated by this transaction? Is it in the nature of interest? Is it business income or capital gains? Interest probably gets kind of out of it because there would not be any debtor-borrower relationship between the buyer and the seller. So the transaction, the income does not get qualified as interest. Whether it's a capital gains or a business income becomes more relevant, and the NBFCs would want to believe, would want to claim it as a business income or a business loss, because they usually transfer these portfolios at times on a frequent basis. In some cases, the NBFCs do claim this loss also as a bad debt, because they are possible to, it's possible for them to write off that amount, saying that they are supposed to recover 100 and they will recover only 80. Now the provisions as regards for bad debt is much more lax as what we did in the past. So, typically the NBFC would want to claim it as a business, because the moment you call it a capital, there will be certain other issues which should be addressed. And then we have this typical interest rate swap arrangements. A little complicated slide, but let me just explain it. So you have two parties in a transaction, A and B. A has taken a loan of 100 from market and is obliged to pay a fixed rate of 18% interest. B has taken a loan from the market at a floating rate, which is 12 plus X, and X is something which is floating and it's a variable. Now A and B both want to come out of their obligations. A believes that is 18 is too high, and A believes that if he moves to floating, probably there's a lesser cost involved. And B believes there's a lot of uncertainty about the rate of interest, and B wants to secure its liability to 18%. He wants to cap its liability to 18%. That's why A and B would enter into interest rate swap. And as per the swap arrangement, depending on the movement of X, the parties would exchange cash. Let's say in year 1, X becomes 4. So the rate of interest which is payable by B is 16%, 12 plus X. And as per, so essentially A is committed that A will pay 16 to B, and B has committed that B will pay 18 to A. And in reality, they are going to net off the two. So only 2% will be paid by B to A as a settlement amount. In year 2, let's say X become 7, so B has an obligation to pay 19%, so that obligation is to be met by A, and A's obligation to be met by B. So they'll do a net settlement of 1 by A will pay 1 to B to settle that obligation. So is this clear? Yeah. So the question which comes up is that what is the character of the cash flows which are emerging from this transaction? Is it in the nature of interest? Is there an obligation to deduct tax on A or B when they exchange these amounts? And then the answer is, before calling it as an interest, you have to look at the definition of interest under section 228A. A and B never lend or borrow money from each other. So there is no basic borrower-lender relationship between the two. What they are settling is only a business obligations which they have incurred. And for that reason, the payments of 1 or 2 which is getting exchanged between the parties cannot be characterized as interest, and clearly there is no obligation on the parties to deduct tax. At times, parties kind of go for a pre-termination of swap arrangements, and then one of them may earn profits out of this, and then RBI prescribes the arrangement for the profits arising from this pre-termination of the contract. RBI says that you are supposed to recognize this as an income over a period of the balance life of the swap arrangement, and the specific question is whether the entire income should be offered to tax, in the year of cancellation, it should be offered to tax over a period of time. So with that, we move to our next structure of securitization. So let me just start from this diagram. So the way it works is that we could have an NBFC which is the originator of the loan. So NBFC may have given several, let's say, housing loans or consumer loans or car loans to various parties or obligators who are the original borrowers. And now NBFC wants to securitize the entire portfolio and want to raise upfront cash. So the entire portfolio will be sold to a structure, to a securitization trust, which is now a well-recognized structure in terms of regulation as well as the tax provisions. So the entire portfolio is getting transferred to the SPV or securitization trust. And the NBFC gets kind of upfront consideration for the entire amount of loans sold, and that amount is kind of reutilized for giving fresh loans. So it's a fresh cycle which is created with that money. Now, where does the SPV get money from? SPV would get the money from the investors. So the investors will be issued security receipts, or they will be issued some instruments. The investors will subscribe to these instruments. So the SPV also, acts like a pooling vehicle. It receives money from various investors, and with that money, it has bought the portfolio. And then there are other parties to the transaction, like the credit rating agency. There are other service providers, which probably are not very relevant from the tax perspective. So, a couple of years back, when they introduced specific provisions for securitization structures. We have section 105. Okay, let's start with section 1023 DA, which says that the income earned by the trust is exempt from tax. So this entity, the entity in the middle, the entire income which is earned by this entity is exempted from tax. It further says, then you have section 115 DA, which is broadly in the nature of DDT or income distribution tax, which is the income which is distributed by the trust to the investors. There is a tax on that income, okay, which works like 154, and then the rate of tax would depend on the status of the investor. If the investor is individual, the rate is 30%. In case of other investors, the rate is individuals, the rate is 25%. Other investors, the rate is 30%. And if the investor is an exempt entity, let's say a mutual fund, then there is no tax payable under section 105 E. So this is the this is the entire scheme of securitization what they have introduced about a couple of years back. Now the issue which has come up in this is that although the portfolio of loans are getting transferred from NBFC here to this, okay, as far as the original borrowers are concerned, okay, the legal contract continues to be on paper with the NBFC and the borrower. So the borrower continues to believe that the money is still due to NBFC, and we looked at section 194A application of TDS. So wherever the borrower is making interest payment, there is a TDS obligation on that. So there is a tax leakage of 10% in this cash flow. And because of this 10% cash leakage, the entire structure does not fly, because NBFC does not offer the income tax. It's not its income. It may, because it's passed on. It's just acting as a conduit for transferring this money. It may never recognize this income in the books of account, or if it recognizes income, there will be corresponding expenditure. So that income does not go to NBFC, but there's a TDS obligation. There is a TDS, which is done by the borrower, and that's a major hurdle. One of the major hurdles for which the structure probably may not be taken, may not be successful. Now, as I said, these provisions were introduced about a couple of years back, and then the structures prevailed even before that. Okay, so even before the specific provisions like 1023 DA and 105 were introduced, the business was done probably broadly in a similar manner, and that was on the basis of the trust taxation principles. And that's what we'll look at it. Under the trust principles, the manner in which the trust is treated under the Act, that it could be seen as a pass-through entity, and by virtue of that, the income which comes in the SPV, has to flow through to the beneficiaries without any TDS obligation, without any income implication. So that's something which people have tried to achieve, and obviously there are challenges in that. So let's look at the trust structures. Trust broadly from tax perspectives could be revocable or irrevocable. Now, we have separate regimes which are dealing with these structures, and essentially what is revocable is that when a person is giving some money to a trust, if it retains the right to call back that money, it's a revocable trust. That's as simple as that, and there's a definition for that. And then you have section 61, which says that if a trust is revocable, if a transfer is revocable, that's what 61 deals with, then any income arising from that transfer is subject to tax in the hands of the transferor. So as if the transfer had never happened, because the entire thing is revocable. So you may have certain structures or certain cases wherein the people may want to rely on the revocability part of it, and saying that although the transfers happen, everything is taxable in the hands of the transfer itself as the transfer demand. Then you may have trusts, or you may have structures which are not revocable, which are called irrevocable trusts, irrevocable transfers. And then the income from such transfer, so from that activity, could be business income or capital gains. If the income is in the nature of business income, it is subject to tax at MMR at the rate of 30%, or whatever the surcharge applicable on that. And if the income is capital gains, then again one has to look at whether the trust is determinate or it is indeterminate. And let me just spend a couple of minutes on the principle of determinate or indeterminate. You have an explanation under section 164, as per which when the trust is created, if the beneficiaries of the trust are always known to everyone, is always known, and the trustee does not have any discretion to distribute the income in a manner other than what is stated in the document, then that's called a determinate trust. If the trust is not determinate, if this condition is not satisfied, then the trust is called indeterminate. And if it's indeterminate, then obviously the income is subject to tax at the rate of MMR. So, this is the entire trust taxation structure. And again, when we come back to the utilization of the structures for the purpose of NBFC securitization transactions, one has to answer these questions. And the first question which comes up is that is the trust determinate or indeterminate trust? So let's go back to the slide. The question which comes up is that is the SPV in between, which is in the form of a trust, is it a determinate trust or it is an indeterminate trust? Now, if you look at the entire structure, the way it is done is that first the sponsor or or the promoter would create a trust. Okay, so when the trust deed is first created, okay, it's only a sponsor who put in maybe 5,000 or 5 lakh rupees is the first transfer, and then under this trust there would be schemes which are being created, and the investors would come in the schemes gradually, in the pooling exercise over a period of time. So if one is to strictly interpret that are the names of all the investors included in the trust deed, okay, the answer would never be yes. But then the way this hurdle is sought to be kind of addressed is that the purpose which is sought to be achieved by the explanation to 164 is that there should not be any discretion left with the trustee. So the question is, if the trustee clearly states the obligation of the trustee to distribute the income in a particular manner to the beneficiaries, then is the parameter of determinate trust met. And then the trustee would typically say that the rights of the investors would be linked to their amount of investment made by them. So there's a clear-cut formula which emerges from the trustee and the other documents which they have created, and based on which one may want to argue that this structure should be treated as a determinate structure. Well, these things were happening for NBFCs, or for private equity players, or for other structures for the last so many years. It was only recently, I think last year, when Security came out with a circular for EIFs, and they said that we will not call this as we call this as an indeterminate trust. That's something which created a major doubt, after so many years. We have very interesting case laws, very old case laws, wherein there was a requirement, as to the partnership were required to be registered, and there will be one partnership, which is a partnership, and the assessing officer is supposed to take a call as whether it's a partnership or not. And there are some cases which say that so far as the percentage and the rights are clearly coming out, it should be treated as a names of the people are known. Now, also try to understand the objective behind this determinate or indeterminate requirements. If you see the entire trust provisions, trust taxation provisions, as such are getting very complicated, because we are probably trying to apply it in the wrong manner. They were not meant maybe for business guys. They were meant for family trust. A father wants to, or a grandfather wants to create a trust for grandsons and those kind of structures. And the provisions of determinate or indeterminate what we are seeing now, they are probably, not probably, they are certainly kind of an anti-abuse provision, which were meant for the abuse which used to happen in the family trust or the individual kind of a trust. And that's why people used to take a lot of liberty by saying that okay, but the name of the people who are going to get this income is not known, so the income cannot be taxed. And from that perspective, the provision of indeterminate trust came, saying that okay, if the beneficiaries are not known, then the entire income is to be taxed at a flat rate of MMR. So it was that kind of a provision. And when we look at now, if we are able to justify that the trustee does not have a discretion and it's coming, clearly emerging from a formula, then the abuse which was thought to be kind of plugged is no more sustaining here. So that is the first issue of determinate versus indeterminate. Then again the question of revocable versus irrevocable comes in. The question is the money which is placed by investor with the SPV, is it a revocable transfer? If it is a revocable transfer, then whatever further income which is generated on that money would always belong to the investor and not to any other entity. So if you succeed in saying that's a revocable transfer, then everything should ultimately belong to the investor. The problem with that kind of a structure could be that if everyone is given the right to recall his money, then the business could be adversely implicated, adversely impacted. So the revocability, may be a challenge, or it may be implemented only in a specified manner. Wherein you say that, okay, fine, only if the 75% of the investors come together, the money could be revoked. Then the question is, how it was sought to be used, in the past, is that the SPV would make the investments. SPV would rely on the provision of section 161, and 161 deals with the rights and obligations of the representative SSE. Now, very interestingly, if you look at, if you have to answer a question, is trust a person under the Act? It's very difficult to answer, because if you look at the definition of person, it's not appearing in the definition. If you look at the format of the forms, somewhere you may find that you can tick on a person. So the question is, what is the legal status of a person? Is it a separate assessable entity for the tax purposes? Okay, probably it remains a question mark. But the way the treatment is given, as if it's a separate taxable entity. Again, when you try to rely on the trust taxation principles, it says under 161, the trustee, which is a representative SSE, is to be taxed in the like manner and to the same extent in which the beneficiaries would have paid tax. So, what they would want to achieve is that when the income gets generated here, they would say that the trust is passed through. So, let the beneficiaries pay tax directly on their own. If at all the trust is to be taxed, it has to pay tax as if the income is getting taxed in the hands of the investor, and that's how the tax should be levied. So if there are 100 investors, and then you have to see what is the tax implication for each of these investors. Someone has a loss, whether that loss could be set off in this against the income which is generated by the investments or not. So those kind of issues would come up. So those were the issues which were there in the old structures, and some of them are in litigation. And then again, the biggest question which comes up is that if it is concluded that the income which is getting generated here is a business income, then the entire income gets taxed at MMR at a flat rate of 30%, and which would again be detrimental to the purpose sought to be achieved by the structure. So obviously these are some of the issues which are not theoretical, because the litigation under the old provisions are still on. We have the AIF related litigations which will come up, and to some extent these are still live. Some other issues in just very starting with these issues. There are service charges which are payable by NBFCs to the foreign parent companies, and again it's a typical transfer pricing issue. The officer will challenge where is the service, what is the service, and a litigation happens there. The NBFCs do have issues with giving PDS credits. NBFCs do make investments in equities and mutual funds. There's also a question of forfeiting disallowance. NBFCs have to do mark-to-market losses, to do mark-to-market and losses on derivatives. So we have one favorable judgment on that. And then probably the last one is the depreciation on leasing lease assets. And for the moment, it's settled by Supreme Court, saying that the person who is giving finance is the legal owner, and we should get the deduction for. So I think with that I'll end my presentation, and I'll thank sure.
Trust structure which you discussed. Now, if the trust is subject to tax, because it is considered discretionary. Now, in terms of beneficiary, there is no taxation because that particular income already subject to tax.
Trust.
Yeah. So, if that trust generates tax income, say for example, share of profit, then the same is exempt from the taxation.
Yes.
Now, again, that very income is distributed among the beneficiaries. So, can we say that income is also subject to tax? Because that particular income has not been subject to tax neither in the hands of trust nor in the hands of beneficiary.
No, that's the whole point. If you come to a conclusion that the trust is carrying on business, okay, then you have to tax the trust at a flat rate of MMR. Okay, so then you probably are not able to kind of rely on in the like manner to the same extent.
But that income is exempted by virtue of section 10(2).
Yes.
So if we say that income is subjected to tax but otherwise not liable because of section 10(2).
Section 10, see, if you are able to rely on 161, which says in the like manner to the same extent, okay, then you are supposed to give that benefit. Okay, but if the conclusion is that it's the business is carried on, or it's an indeterminate trust, okay, then you're not able to rely on that. So in a plain vanilla, it's not a business income, it is a determinate trust, and the tax which will be levied on the trust, then yes, it will be possible to get benefit of section 10, saying that on that income of Mr. X, who is having 5% share in the entire income, tax cannot be levied because he is entitled to that. But if you come to a conclusion that it's a indeterminate trust, then the entire income gets taxed.
Determinate trust and beneficiaries can be taxed.
Yes, if the trust is determinate, okay, then it acts as a complete pass-through, and the income finally goes in the hands of the ultimate beneficiaries.
Beneficiaries won't be entitled to benefit of section 10.
No, beneficiary will be entitled to section 10.
Section 10 is to the SP.
Okay, the entire discussion is not on the new structures; it's on the old regime. Okay, so we have to look at which structure we're looking at. The structures which are under the new regime, after this 1020 DA which comes in, the benefit of 1020 DA is only to the trust, not to the SP. That you get. Yeah.
Provision for entry is allowed with direction for purpose of rent.
No, that's also a question mark because the officer will say that this is unascertained liability.
And it's a provision for decrease in value of assets, so it's required to be added back.
Thank you, Radhakishan ji. I think we have completed all our sessions. Only one request I want to make all of you. The persons who are not member of the chamber, kindly become a member and kindly visit our site and kindly give your feedback for this program also. With this, I request Rahul to give the board of thanks.